Hello Wargamers and welcome to Let's Get Critical. My name is Gar. In this video I'll be showing you how we painted the Deathwatch kill team that came in the Kill Team Tomb World box set. These critically quick series of painting guides have been designed to show you the colours we chose and the techniques we used when painting our models for the battle reports on our channel. If you'd like to see how we achieved this look for our Deathwatch kill team, then please sit back, relax, and let's get painting. For the first step, I'll be using some PVA glue I got from the Army Painter. I'll be using some brown Battleground from the Army Painter. I'll be using some fine sand I got from the DIY store. And for the brush, I'll be using the Citadel starter brush that came with a paint set. What I want to do first is get some basing material down onto this base before I start priming the model. It's a really quick and easy step and it only takes a few minutes. I put some of the PVA glue onto my palette and then start using the brush just to smear quite a thick layer onto the base. I kept the glue away from the feet because I didn't want any sand or basing rocks on those parts, and then once the base was finished and covered in the glue, I then just started to apply the basing materials. I used the brown Battleground first. I used my fingertips to sprinkle a small amount of the basing material all over the base. I didn't want to use too much of this as the pieces are quite large, and when I got to this point here I was happy, and then I started to add some sand. Using my fingertips again, I sprinkled sand all over the base until it was fully covered, and after I'd finished with the sand, the model started to look like this. I put the model down and I left it to go fully dry before moving on to the next step. Now that the base was dry, I wanted to add another coat of the PVA glue all over the top of the basing material just to seal it in and make it more suitable to paint over. I got another drop of the PVA glue onto my palette and I then used the brush to keep adding drops of water until the glue was a lot runnier and it was easier to paint with. Once I was happy with the consistency, I then started to give the base a coat of the glue. This is done, like I say, to help seal the sand in and it makes the basing materials much easier to paint over, as we'll see in the next step of the video. I then let the model go bone dry, and this is what the model looked like after the base was finished. Now it's time to move on to the first colours. The first colour that I used was a Citadel base colour and it's called Corvus Black. And for the brush I'll be using this cheap brush that I got from the hobby store. Lots of people I know like to use spray paint or they like to use an airbrush to prime their models, but I personally prefer to use a big brush. It's much easier and more convenient than spraying, and it works out cheaper in the long run as well. When I'm priming my models, I always follow these steps. First, I load the brush with quite a lot of paint, and then I use the palette to work the paint into the bristles. Then to apply the paint, I start by dabbing the paint all over the model. I use the long bristles of this cheap brush to ram the paint into all of the recesses and hard to reach places, and I'm not too concerned about damaging the brush because it only costs a few pounds. Once I've dabbed the paint into all of the nooks and crannies of the model, I then start spreading the paint around. I start by using large circular motions and I use the long bristles to my advantage, and I keep going around and round, and then I go up and down, and I just keep smearing the paint all over the model, and I keep doing this for about 2 minutes, and then I set the model down to go bone dry. After the model is dry, I then just repeat the process. I load some paint onto the brush, I dab it all over the model, and then I spread the paint around for a minute or two until the model is fully covered. Priming this model only took a few minutes, and this is what the model looks like after it had been primed. And now it's time to move on to the next step and start adding some more colours. The next colour that I used was a Citadel base colour and it's called Skavenblight Dinge. And for the brush I'll be using this worn regiment brush from the Army Painter. Now I want to build up a very dark grey camouflage onto this armour of this model. I'm going to do this using a technique called stippling, And this technique is great for building up a random effect and works brilliantly when doing camo style patterns. I want to quickly guide you through the processes I use when stippling. First, you need to get a small amount of the paint onto the end of the brush like this. Then you need to work that paint into the bristles of the brush, and then you need to start dabbing the paint onto the palette like this. You want to keep dabbing it around until the paint is evenly spread over the bristles of the brush. Then you want to use the kitchen roll and very gently just dab the brush a couple of times to remove the excess paint. The next step is to apply the paint to the model. What you do is to very gently start stippling the paint over the areas that you want to build the camo pattern onto. As you can see here, I start down on his leg and I just add some very gentle and controlled stippling. As you can see here, look, just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I load and then I prepare the brush again. And then I go back to stippling 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then I load and I prepare the brush again. And then to finish the leg, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and done. And that's the leg finished. I then use the same technique to stipple the Skavenblight Dinge onto his other leg. After I finish with the leg, I've then moved on to his torso. And after the torso, I move around to his backpack. And then finally, I moved on to his arm. After I'd stippled this colour onto the model, I just went straight into the next colour and started stippling again. The next colour I'll be using is a Citadel layer paint, and it's called Eshin Grey. Now, I used the exact same method as before. I just loaded the brush and prepared the brush with the new colour. I used the kitchen roll to remove some of the excess paint, and then I just start stippling it onto the model. I start with his leg here, and then when I finish, I move on to the other leg. And then after that, I move on to his torso, and then onto his backpack. And finally, I finish off on his arm. After I'd finished with the Eshin Grey colour, I just move straight into the next and final colour that I'll be using for stippling. The final colour I'll be using on this armour is a Citadel base colour, and it's called Mechanicus Standard Grey. Just like the other two colours, using the same techniques, I stippled the final colour over his entire body the same way as the other colours. Now, this stippling technique is a great way to apply a quick and effective camo pattern over your models. I use it all the time when I'm painting, and I think it's absolutely brilliant. If you haven't tried it for yourself, I really suggest you should go out there, try it, give it a go, and see what you think for yourself. This is what the model looks like after being stippled. I'm happy at this point, and it's time to move on to the next step. The next colour I'll be using is a Citadel layer paint, and it's called Dawnstone. And for the brush, I'll be using the small dry brush from Citadel. Now, dry brushing is one of the simplest and most effective painting techniques that you can learn. It adds a level of dimension to your models and really makes all of the details in the sculpts pop out and look absolutely brilliant. I'm not sure if you've watched any of my other painting videos, but I'll quickly run through the processes I use for dry brushing. The first thing you need to do is make sure the bristles of the brush are clean and that they're ready to use. You then need to apply just a really small amount of paint onto the end of the brush like this. A drop of paint like this is all you need. Then you need to work the paint into the bristles of the brush. Here I'm using a palette I picked up from the local hobby store. It's perfect for this sort of work. Next, you need to use a piece of kitchen towel to remove most of the paint off the bristles of the brush. And essentially, you're left with a brush that looks like this. It has a relatively large bristle with very, very little paint left on them. And finally, you just need to start gently flicking the brush over the areas of the model that you want to dry brush the colour onto. Here you can see I'm concentrating the dry brush all over the power armour. I'm just being very careful, and I'm very slowly building up the Dawnstone colour until it really starts to stick out over all that stippling work that we did earlier in the video. After a while, you need to reload the brush with more paint, so you just follow the steps as before, and then you just carry on dry brushing. This model is getting quite a heavy dry brush. For a highlight dry brush, you would spend more time removing excess paint from the bristles of the brush, but as I want this lush light grey colour to be very noticeable, I'm only using the kitchen paper to remove the bulk of the paint. After I'd finished dry brushing all of the model's power armour, I then moved down onto the base. I will be adding more to this base later in the video, but for now, a good dry brush is all it needs to make all those basing materials that we applied earlier really stick out and start to look amazing. All the dry brushing has been completed now, and this is what the model looks like. Now it's time to move on to the next colour. The next colour I'll be using is a Citadel layer paint, and it's called Ironbreaker, and for the brush I'll be using the character brush from the Army Painter. It's time to start adding some details to this model now, and I've started to use my wet palette. Using a wet palette is a great way to keep your paints at a runny, milk-like consistency, which is always the best thing to do when you're applying the details to a model. I want to start by adding the metallic colours. Ironbreaker is a nice, bright metallic paint that I think will look brilliant on this model. I'm starting with the Deathwatch shoulder pad and the arm on the left-hand side. Now, Deathwatch operatives have a unique way of styling their power armour. On the right-hand side, they carry the shoulder pad from their original Astartes chapter, but on the left-hand side, they have a special Deathwatch shoulder pad with its own insignia. I'm using the brush just to paint these areas in a nice, thin and even coat of paint. I'm using the wet palette to keep loading the brush with fresh paint that has a nice consistency to it. After I had finished with the left shoulder and the arm, I moved on to other parts of the model. I painted the Aquila on his chest and the Inquisition markings on his leg. I painted the pistol in his right hand. I painted the sword in his left hand. I painted these grenades here on his belt, the grip of his dagger and the buckle on his belt. I painted these vents and the exhausts on his backpack and these skull markings and some of the sections and the pipes here around the servo skull which is attached to the backpack. And finally, I painted the device on his wrist and the Inquisition symbols here around his wrist as well. After all these details were painted, I let the model go bone dry, and then I went round all of these areas again so they'd all had 2 thin coats of the Ironbreaker. This is what the model looks like when it was dry after the second coat. Now it's time to move on to the next colour. The next colour I'll be using is a Citadel base paint called Caliban Green, and for the brush I'll carry on using the character brush from the Army Painter. I want to paint the right hand shoulder pad for this Watch Sergeant, and I've chosen the Nemesis chapter as the colour scheme for his original Astartes chapter. They have a dark green shoulder pad with a white skull and a red trim. The first step was to paint the whole shoulder pad in a thin layer of Caliban Green, and then when it was dry I just went over it again to give it 2 thin coats. I then moved on to the next colour, which will be a Citadel layer paint called Wazdakka Red. I used this red colour to paint the trim of the shoulder pad, and I was very careful not to get any of the red paint onto the green. And I just built up the colour really slowly. Again, after it was dry, I went over the trim one more time and then moved on to the final colour. And that final colour I'll be using on the shoulder pad is a Citadel base paint called Corax White. The last part to paint on this Nemesis shoulder pad was the skull in the middle. I loaded the tip of the brush with a small amount of paint from the wet palette, and very carefully I just picked it out and gave it 2 thin coats of the Corax White. Here's what the model looks like now. The shoulder pad's finished. I think it's looking absolutely fantastic, and it's time to move on and finish all the detail work on this Watch Sergeant model. The next colour I'll be using is a Citadel base paint, and it's called Khorne Red. I used Khorne Red to paint just a couple of sections. First I painted the pistol casing on the weapon system in his right hand, and then I painted the grip of the power sword which he's holding in his left hand. The next colour I'll be using is a Citadel base paint called Mephiston Red. And I want to move on to the purity seals. I used Mephiston Red to paint the top parts of these purity seals. There's one here on his chest, and then there's one down here, down on his belt buckle. After they were dry, I gave them 2 coats and moved on to the next colour. The next colour I'll be using is a Citadel layer paint called Pallid Witch Flesh. I wanted to finish off the purity seals, so the parchments that hang from them, I used the Pallid Witch Flesh to paint those parchments. I gave them 2 thin coats and then just moved on to the next section. The next colour I'll be using is a Citadel base paint and it's called Zandri Dust. I used Zandri Dust to paint the servo skull that's attached to his backpack. I just took my time and using the wet palette and the tip of the brush, I slowly built up the colour, and then when it was dry, I went over it again and just moved straight on. The next colour I'll be using is a Citadel layer paint called Canoptek Alloy. I used this final colour just to pick out one of the wires that trails from the servo skull. I used this basically just to add a little variation to the model and to stop it looking dull and boring. I've now finished adding all the details to the model and it's now time to move on. Here's what the model looks like now, and it's time to move on and do some shading. The next colour that I used was a Citadel shade paint called Nuln Oil. And for the brush, I'll be using the medium shade brush from Citadel. Now that all the detail work on the body of this Deathwatch Watchmaster is complete, I want to apply a shade to give it some depth and to make it stand out and look great. Shading is one of my most favourite parts of painting. It adds a real level of dimension to the model and it helps to stop it look flat and dull and boring, and it also hides any of those tiny imperfections. When shading, there are a few steps to go through to get the job done right. First, you need to apply a generous amount of this shade paint to the areas of the model that you want to cover, just like I'm doing here now. Then you want to keep moving the paint around and smearing it all over the model, and make sure you have a liberal coat all over the areas you're wanting to cover. Make sure it's in all of the recesses and it's covered everywhere with an even coat. What I do then is I just leave it for a few minutes while I get some kitchen rolls set up, ready for the next step. The final step is to clean the brush and dry it. Then you use the bristles of the brush to soak up any pools of paint like a sponge. You don't want these pools of paint on the model because if they dry, they will spoil the detail and it will start to look terrible. I keep using the kitchen roll to dry off the brush and then start soaking up more of the shade paint, and then dry off the brush again, and then soak up some more of the shade paint, and I keep doing this until I'm happy there are no more puddles and pools on the model. This is what the model looks like after I'd applied the shade paint and let it go dry. It's now time to move on to the next section of this model. The next colour that I used was a Citadel base paint and it's called Grey Knight Steel. And for the brush I'll be using the character brush from the Army Painter. I now want to finish the Deathwatch armour on this Watchmaster model. I'm happy with the armour so far, but there are a couple of colours I want to use to get this armour looking fantastic. I'm using the wet palette to thin down some of the Grey Knight Steel, and then I'm using just the tip of the brush and I'm just very gently flicking over these letters and these numerals that are engraved onto his armour. I just want to catch the raised areas to really show them off. I'm only going over them once with a very thin coat, and then I did the same on other parts of the model. I did the same on the guards of his sword here, the Inquisition letters here on his Aquila, and this Inquisition letter here down on his leg. After they were dry, I moved on to the final colour to finish off his armour details. The next colour that I used was a Citadel base paint called Retributor Armour, and for the brush I'll be using the Insane Detail brush from the Army Painter. I've now switched over and started to use the Army Painter Insane Detail brush. This is the smallest brush I use, and I use it solely for detail work like this. I used this Retributor Armour colour to paint all of the skulls on his armour here. I painted this skull here on his left shoulder pad. I painted the skull here on his sword, this skull on his backpack, and finally the one here on his helmet. I'm calling the armour finished now. I'm happy at this point. It's now time to move on to the final colours and get this model finished. The next colour that I used was a Citadel layer paint called Moot Green, and for the brush I'll be using the Insane Detail brush from the Army Painter. Moot Green is a lush, vibrant green that has an almost glowing effect to it. I'm using this colour to paint in just a few final details on the model. I painted this piece here on the scanner, which is on his backpack. I painted this sensor here on his servo skull attachment. And finally, I painted the sensor here on his helmet. I'm calling this model finished here, so I just want to move down and add a few more details to the base. The next colour I'll be using is a Citadel colour technical paint called Valhallan Blizzard, and for the brush I'll be using this cheap De La Rowley size 10 synthetic brush. I'll also be using these tufts I got from the Army Painter and some super glue that I got from the DIY store. For these final few steps, I just want to concentrate on getting the base done properly. First, I used the super glue to glue these tufts down onto the base. I used some tweezers to hold the tufts into place, and I applied a drop of the glue to the bottom, and then I pushed them down into their locations, and then I used the tweezers just to make sure they were flat and stuck down. I did this for both of the tufts, and then I set the model down and let it go bone dry. After it was dry, I got some of the Valhallan Blizzard like this, and I began smearing it all over the base. Now I want some of this snow effect paint to cover the tufts, and I want it to cover his feet, and I want it to cover all of the rest of the base as well. After I'd applied the snow effect paint, and after this was dry, I moved on to the final colour for this model. The final colour is Abaddon Black, and I'm using this just to paint round the trim of the base, just to tidy everything up and make sure it all looks neat and tidy. I have had a great time painting this Watchmaster model and all of the other models in the kill team. Here's what the model looks like now that everything's been completed. I'm going to leave you with a final outro that will show you all the other models in the Deathwatch kill team. My name is Gar. Thank you for watching Let's Get Critical. Bye bye.